Mob Psycho 100 anime has been around for a while. Let's see. Oh, well, yeah, look at that. 5 years. I heard about Mob Psycho 100 a lot around season 2 when that was airing, and it was really popular, but I never really got around to ever watching it. And that was just simply because I had a lot on my mind at the time, and I was super busy, and especially that period in my life wasn't really the good point in my life, so I was really distracted, to say the least. But I finally got around to watching it recently, and yeah. It's pretty good. I actually really enjoyed it. And that's just the first season. I've only seen the first season so far, and that's what we're here to talk about. The first season of the Mob Psycho 100 anime. And of course, the main thing that I guess we should point out is that this show was originally a web comic that was released by the creator under the pseudonym of One. He released the web comic known as One Punch Man, and that later got serialized into a weekly shonen anime. Or weekly shonen manga, and then into an anime. And the same thing happened with Mob Psycho 100, which was pretty interesting. And I had watched One Punch Man, and then season 2 came out, and I also watched that, which I also reviewed if you want to check out those really shitty videos if you really care to do that. And recently, after rewatching the entirety of the Naruto franchise, just because that's something I had been meaning to do for a little while, I decided that I needed something new to watch. And I should be watching and reviewing Attack on Titan Season 4, but we're not going to get to that today. So today we're talking about Mob Psycho. That was something that I had been meaning to watch for a long time, and I finally got around to watching it. And it was something that was what I was expecting, because it is from the creator of One Punch Man, so I expected super high octane action, but as well as comedy. And indeed, the show does have the same comedy style as that of One Punch Man, which was really refreshing to see again, because I haven't seen this style of comedy in an anime in a very long time, as it's been a good few years since the second season for One Punch Man has come out, and I don't know when there's actually going to be a third season, and I don't know who's going to be animating it, so only time will tell whenever we're going to get the next season for One Punch Man. So Mob Psycho 100 was actually a really refreshing reintroduction to this creator's comedy style, so it was actually really nice to see this sort of humor once again, and I actually really liked seeing it. And a lot of times it was really funny, especially the finale of the season with that episode. I thought it was really funny considering what happens, which we'll get to in a moment. But of course, because it is a action comedy anime, shonen anime, it has what you expect, especially considering that it's actually animated by Bones, who is the same studio behind animating My Hero Academia, which, you know, whenever Bones does fantastic work with whatever animation they're doing for whatever show, it's typically pretty good. And yeah, no surprise, any anime, the animation is indeed very good. And it also has elements of supernatural, and that was something that I wasn't really expecting when going into that, because the world itself revolves around the story of a character called Mob, but his real name is Shigeo, and he is an Esper. And Espers are essentially beings within the world who have psychic powers, and they have a multitude of different abilities. And Mob just so happens to be one of the most powerful Espers in the entirety of the world, but he suppresses his powers by essentially having no emotions at all. And whenever his emotions succeed a certain limit, his psychic powers then go out of control, and then whatever emotion he's currently feeling at that time then decides to let loose. Like, so far in season 1, we've seen rage and rejection and sadness and almost murderous intent, the episode before the finale episode of the season. And I think it's a really interesting concept that we have this character who has to suppress his emotions whenever, because in comparison we have a lot of shonen anime that revolve around the characters and their emotions, and the fact that they gain a lot of power through their emotion. Let me show you an example with these two characters. We have one character, through his rage of seeing a loved one being killed right in front of him, he was able to harness his emotions and harness the power that he gained from letting his emotions loose, and he took control over it and was able to harness it and use it from the foreseeable future as he unlocked that technique. Whereas we have another character where, by letting his emotions loose, he completely loses control of his power, and after he regains control of his composure and his powers, he doesn't remember anything at all, and he can't harness his power in whatsoever way. Goku was able to harness the powers of the Super Saiyan transformation after he unleashed his rage against Frieza, whereas Mob, anytime he lets his emotions loose, he never gains control over his powers. He always lets them loose, and he doesn't really remember anything that happens. Most of the time, whenever it does happen, he doesn't really remember anything, which I just like how it's different from other shonen anime that typically have this trope within their show. I like how it's different, and I like how Mob Psycho 100 does something different with this what it is, what it is. It is a trope. The thing I think I liked the most about the first season for Mob Psycho 100 is that the first half of the first half of the season treats it like it's a slice of life, so not a lot really happens. More so, it introduces a couple of characters who are probably going to be reoccurring, and introduces Mob and the Espers and the powers and what they're capable of, and how Mob's emotions work to begin with, and what happens if he loses control over his emotions. And then, of course, just how the world works to begin with, and what's within the world. Like, there are these evil spirits who are, some of them are significantly more powerful, and then later on in the second half of the season, we actually see someone who's able to take control of those evil spirits and use them to his advantage. So, and we actually later also get a character called Dimple who also tags along with Mob and becomes an ally to him and his friends, and also his brother. Which I also really liked how initially Mob's brother kind of starts with not being really important in any specific way, as he doesn't even have psychic powers at all. It actually seems like Mob is the only person in his family who actually has psychic powers, but then later Mob's brother gains psychic powers and becomes significantly more important to the story. And they later tie into one another, and their characters develop off of each other, which I also found very interesting as well. And the fact that how Mob's brother even attained psychic powers to begin with, I also thought that was interesting in comparison to how other people have gotten their own psychic powers from the explanation that we've gotten from other characters. Like, it's explained that if you go through a specific amount of experimentation, you can gain powers. It's also explained that if you go through intense pain, then you can also get psychic powers, which is why they do the experiments to be able to get that. So you can make the estimate of the reason why Ritsu, who's Mom's brother, was able to get powers is because he felt disgusted with himself, and he had an inferiority complex in comparison with his brother, and he felt a deep pain within his soul and his body that later manifested into his psychic powers. And of course, he does the one thing that one of the other characters that we then meet, Hanazawa, I believe, and he uses his psychic powers to his own benefit, and he just kind of basically becomes an asshole. And the fact that we actually get to see characteristics of people that do that do have psychic powers before we even meet the Claw organization, who use their psychic powers for the betterment of themselves instead of just having them just for the sake of having them, is pretty interesting. Ultimately, like I was trying to say, the first half of the season is basically a slice of life anime where a couple of things happen. Like, Mob is hanging around with his master, who's basically just this guy who tries to act like he's doing exorcist on evil spirits, but he can't actually see them, and he doesn't even have psychic powers at all. And so he's basically just using Mob and his powers to be able to get paid and deal with the evil spirits whenever there are actually evil spirits. Then we see him at the school, where his goal and his dream in life is to basically just get with this girl that he has a crush on since he was a kid. And through what his master was saying, Reagan, I believe his name is, he says that psychic powers aren't enough to be popular. So Mob decides that the only thing that he has left to do is, instead of improving his psychic powers and learning to harness and control them properly, whilst not having the problem of letting his emotions loose and losing control of his powers, he instead decides that the best thing to do is to join a club that helps him improve his body and get more muscle mass and better stamina, which I thought was really funny, because the episode that happens was also pretty funny as well, where we get a couple of side characters who are looking for telepaths, and Mob is definitely a candidate for being a telepath because of his psychic powers. But instead of joining that, and once again, like I said, potentially finding more people that also have psychic powers and trying to harness his own, he decides to go ahead and join a different club entirely. So I thought that was pretty funny. Then we see an episode where we see Mob let loose of his emotions. We see it a couple of times as the first half of the season goes on. This is actually a really recurring thing that happens in multiple episodes. But in one specifically, he's fighting Hanazawa, who's another Esper who's natural born with powers, and he uses his psychic powers for his own self-benefit instead of just using it for others, or just for whatever reason other than using it for his own self-benefit. And in the episode, he's fighting, and he was taught to not use his psychic powers against other people, and then he later lets loose of his emotions, and he destroys an entire other district school, and then puts it all back together, because the emotion that he then feels after that time is sadness, and that recreates everything that was later destroyed. And Hanazawa later ends up becoming an ally for Mob, when he later previously was arguably an antagonist for Mob, which I thought was pretty interesting. Later on, it continues on more. We see a couple of other side characters. Some are more interesting than others. Some of them are pretty entertaining. Some of them are just like kind of whatever, they're there in the background. And then we get into the stuff with Claw. They're an organization of espers who have psychic powers, who are trying to get world domination, and that's pretty much all the character motivation that they need, because this is a pretty simple story. It doesn't need anything extravagant like Naruto, for an example, that has Madara, who's trying to go through all these exaggerated ways of trying to get eternal peace for the entire world, like taking the cells of Hashirama and putting it to his body, then awakening the Rinnegan, then taking Obito and having Obito do all this bullshit with fucking Nagato and his and Madara's Rinnegan and all this other shit, and then bringing on the Getamazo and trying to, you know, regrow the God Tree and take the Chakra Fruit and put everyone under the Infinite Tsukuyomi. My point is basically is that the villains in Mob Psycho 100 are very simple. They don't need to be, you know, extravagant. They don't need to be, you know, anything special. They just need to be a simplistic enough villain that services the story for what it's worth. And ultimately, it all pretty much services the comedy, because we see Mob continue on. He's fighting more along with a couple of his friends like Hanazawa and then later his brother. And in the final episode, we just see him culminate everything into his master, where he decides that he's not going to fight because sometimes he doesn't need to, and that it's okay to not fight. And instead, the power that he manifests, which is during the moment where he's about to go 100% murderous intent with that emotion, and all that power transfers over to Reagan, and he just decimates this entire district of the Claw members, to the point where Reagan is somehow able to talk to them out of being a part of this organization, and they just decide to quit, whilst another one gets beaten severely, and another one just gets kicked out of the organization by, assumably from what I can tell, the son of the main bad guy of the Claw organization. And that's basically it. That's kind of the entirety of the show. It's a whole bunch of comedy, a whole bunch of action, some elements of supernatural, and in the beginning moments of slice of life. But I think that's okay, because it doesn't need to be anything, like I said, extravagant. It just needs to service whatever the creator is trying to do, which is just trying to tell the story about a character who has these amazing powers and can do amazing things with them, but instead he doesn't, and instead he just decides to be a normal person, and that's all he ever really is trying to do. Mob is just trying to be a regular ass person because he had a brother with him the whole time who didn't have psychic powers, and he's always admired his younger brother because even without psychic powers, he was incredibly reliable and knew how to get around the world and society even without psychic powers. And so that's why Mob doesn't try to use his powers all the time. That's why he takes the rule of not using his powers against other people. And the entire time, the series is constantly pushing him against the wall where he needs to use his powers against actual people, and that's going to progress even further when we get into the next season. But I haven't started watching that yet, and I probably won't be able to start watching it until I finally get this video out. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the first season. It's a good introducing season, and the first half was pretty funny with and it starts off a little slow, and I liked a couple of elements, but then it started getting way more intense and way more interesting as it continued on further, and I'm interested to see what happens in the second season. And I'll admit that I was a little bit more intrigued about the show, considering that it was recently announced that I think it's getting a third season. So whenever that's going to come out, whenever that's announced that's going to come out, I don't know if it has or not. I might have to look into that since I started watching it. I'll let you know whatever my thoughts are on that show, on that season, whenever it does come out. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap things up. If you liked the video, be sure to like. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. I'm out. Peace. Drop that